Yo, what's up guys, Alf here, and today I'm going to be doing another tier list on the channel, kind of in the same vein as the last one I did where I looked at the historic ban list. In this one we're going to be looking at the cards that are currently nerfed in historic, and I'm going to be rating them into 4 categories. Either why is this still nerfed, you know, stuff that could very easily just go back to its original form with basically no risk at all. Then probably safe to revert, stuff that I would like to see go back to normal, but there is still some caveats and some risks to doing it. Then on the flip side, stuff that I think you could make an argument for reverting back to its original form, but there are a lot of risks, so I would rather not. And then finally, keep nerfed, you know, pretty self-explanatory stuff that I do think is good in its current form and poses a lot of problems if you go back to the original as well. And now a couple of caveats. I'm not going to be talking about stuff that was banned specifically for alchemy that's likely to be reverted when it rotates. So I think Swiftspear's Teachings and Corey Steelcutter are good examples of that. Maybe stuff like Vivi or Tenyear as well. And I'm also not going to be covering stuff that was buffed. All of this stuff is going to be, you know, in the same vein as the ban list video, stuff that used to be really oppressive or too powerful at its time and then was nerfed to address it. So I'm not going to be covering stuff like Symmetry Sage that got buffed by a rebalance, if that makes sense. Again, I'm not really going to be discussing potential different ways that they could change the nerf either. This video is basically going to be, do I like the card as it is now, or do I want to revert back to the original? Although if I do think of some interesting ways they could maybe rebalance it so it's somewhere in the middle, we could maybe talk about that as well. But for the most part, I'm just going to be going through and thinking whether I prefer them in their original form in the current state of historic, or whether I think they should stay nerfed as well. And we're starting off with a couple of strange ones because Leah and Alrund's Epiphany, I believe, were both nerfed when Alchemy first became a format. I believe standard was, or the dominant standard deck of the time was Is It Turns with Alrund's Epiphany, Leah. I think Divide by Zero also got nerfed and then got reverted, whereas these two cards didn't. So the difference with Leah was that you could only flashback cards from your graveyard during your turn. And, I mean, might as well talk about these two together. Alrund's Epiphany, I also think, was changed so that you don't get the tokens if you don't foretell it. So if you just cast it for its mana cost, you take an extra turn, but you don't get the tokens. And these two are just baffling. I don't understand why they're still nerfed, because, like I said, I think these were originally alchemy nerfs that should have been reverted back to their original. Like I said, I think Divide by Zero was done at around the same time and that's been reverted. I think Hullbreaker Horror was done around the same time and that's been reverted. So I'm really confused why Leah and Alrund's Epiphany are both still nerfed. Even in their original forms, they weren't good enough to see play back when they were big in standard. So these ones are just baffling to me. I thought I'd put them first because they're kind of outliers here. Basically, every other card that was nerfed specifically for alchemy has been reverted apart from these two. And like I said, I don't think they were ever even a factor in historic at all, so that one kind of baffles me. Definitely going to put these in why is this still nerfed. Then next up, Guide of Souls. So this was changed from requiring 3 energy to give a creature the buff with flying to 4 energy, and I actually like this buff quite a lot. You know, I think a common theme in this tier list video for me is if the nerfed version is still seeing play in historic, then I think it's good to keep it nerfed, right? And I think Guide of Souls, not only does it still see play, but it's the cornerstone of a lot of those low-to-the-ground aggressive Lurrus decks, whether you've got Boros Energy, Mardu, obviously sees play in Val as well. So the fact that this card is still seeing a lot of play in its nerfed form is a really good sign to me that we should absolutely keep it nerfed. And same sort of thing with Ocelot Pride. The fact that this still does commonly see play in Energy and a few other shells as well says to me that they've nailed it with the rebalances on these two cards. I think, you know, they're both still powerful and playable, but they're not as oppressive as they were. And if you played around MH3 launch, you know how just absolute dominant this deck was. I believe there was a qualifier around the same sort of time that Energy just blew everything else out of the water. All the Energy lists that did well were very tuned to beat the mirror match, so I'm very happy to keep these both nerfed. I think Energy is at a good power level right now, and reverting both of these would just make the deck too oppressive and too powerful. Same sort of thing, Galvanic Discharge was also nerfed with these two as well, and whilst I do want to keep it in its nerfed form, I do think there's more of an argument to reverting it compared to these two. Now, I personally don't love Galvanic Discharge in Energy because I feel like 2 damage, you know, you're basically playing it as a shock that can't go face when you cast it without any other energy. So I personally prefer other options, but I know a lot of other people who do play a lot of Energy do still quite like this card, and it does still see play in its reverted form. Oh, sorry, in its nerfed form. So I think I'm going to put it here in Risky to Revert, not quite on the same level of Guide of Souls and Ocelot Pride. I do think if it did get reverted, it would see a lot of play, but having said that, if we look at the Energy decks now, a lot of the cards that saw play originally, like Unstable Amulet, for example, don't really see that much play anymore. So your only real source of energy outside of Galvanic Discharge is Guide of Souls. So if you don't open with the Guide of Souls, this is basically kind of like a bad shock in a lot of situations. But having said that, that's still going to kill a lot of the cheap creatures in the format. And obviously, once you do build up a lot of energy from Guide of Souls, this can kill big creatures as well, which is a really big deal. And obviously, I guess Amped Raptor is obviously another card that can produce energy. Completely slipped my mind for a second. But yeah, overall, I do think this would be more acceptable to revert than these two. But the fact it's still seeing play is a good sign that I think we should probably keep it in its nerfed form. Then next up we got Dragon's Rage's Channeler. So this was nerfed back when Is It Phoenix was one of the best decks in the format, and the nerf here is that once you have Delirium Online, the original's a 3-3 and the nerfed version is a 3-1. And for me, I'm just going to put this straight into why is this still nerfed. Ever since the nerf, this has barely seen any play, really, right? Maybe seen experimentation in sort of prowess-style decks, but for the most part, Is It Wizards has been the de facto prowess deck in Historic, and it doesn't really fit there because it's not Wizards itself, which is kind of a deal-breaker in that sort of deck. And then outside of that, it has seen some experimentation in Underworld Breach decks to fill the graveyard and allow you to storm off. And since we did get Manamorphose recently, I have been more optimistic that Ruby Storm could maybe be viable in Historic. Again, I feel like we need more ritual effects. I feel like that sort of build is too reliant on choosers like Gamble in recent testing, but for the most part, this is basically seeing no play outside of Fringe decks. And also the other big thing with this card is that the nerf is so small compared to a lot of the other cards on this list, right? The difference between a 3-3 and a 3-1 once you've already got Delirium Online is so small compared to a card like Ocelot Pride, where you'd be taking an entire mana off the cost of it. So for me, I'm going to put this straight into why is this still nerfed. I do think that if it was a bigger nerf that the card had, then maybe there's, more of an argument to put it in here. And as the video goes on, I'm also going to maybe be reshuffling stuff once I get a better picture of where everything is going to go. So we will reassess later. But for me, DRC straight into why is this still nerfed. Just because I think, like I said, it barely sees any play, and the nerf is so small. I think there's so little risk to putting it back. Unholy Heat was also nerfed at basically the same time. Both hits to Is It Phoenix. And this, for me, is straight into why is this still nerfed again. I think one of the biggest issues with Historic, especially recently, has been that we don't have that much good quality interaction compared to the quality of the threats we've got. So, better single target removal, especially in red, is so lacking in Historic right now. I think if you're playing a mono red deck, your quality of interaction is so low that not having access to Unholy Heat in its unnerved form is a big problem. And well, like I said, I just think the lack of quality interaction has been a problem in Historic for a while. And unnerving Unholy Heat, I don't think it would be too oppressive at all. The metagame and just the current landscape of Historic is so different to when these originally got nerfed. I think Unholy Heat nerf would not only be safe, but I actually think it would be a net positive for the format as well. So I'm happy to put this in why is it still nerfed as well. Then Geological Appraiser. This is an interesting one. So this was changed from 4 to 5 mana, so quite a substantial nerf, but if you played when this card was around, you'll know why. Basically, the whole deck was built around Geological Appraiser. You would also run some redundancy for this sort of effect with Trumpeting Carnosaur, and there's a 5 mana Naya Discover creature that was also run in those sorts of decks that the name eludes me right now. But basically the whole deck was built around these sorts of cards being able to just win the game on their own, right? You would cast Geological Appraiser oftentimes on turn 3 if you had like a Magma Opus, for example. And then the way you would build the deck is you would basically run only Clone Effects and Eldritch Evolution for Geological Appraiser to hit, and then you would basically just swarm the battlefield, Eldritch Evolution a couple of times, get a bunch of Trumpeting Carnosaurs in play, and then you would get a Doomscar Giant or some other way to give your entire board haste and just attack out of nowhere. So the big issue with this card is that it can just win from a completely empty board, right? If you have 4 mana and the opponent's been thought seizing you a bunch to you've got like nothing on the board, nothing in your hand, you could just rip a Geological Appraiser off the top, cast it, and then you just win the game if the opponent doesn't have a way to kill it or break up the combo. And the fact it could be done on turn 3 pretty consistently because of the number of treasure generators like Magma Opus, for example, that you could run in this sort of deck meant it was not great for gameplay reasons, right? If you're up against this deck and they're on the play, and you tap out on your turn 2, on their turn 3 at the end of your turn 2 they can just go Magma Opus, turn 3 Appraiser, and just win the game, which isn't exactly a great play pattern, right? Constantly having to hold up interaction against it didn't really feel great, and also again, it's not a popular deck, but I have actually been returning to it fairly recently. I put out a deck building deep dive video on it a few months back in the 5-mana form, and I did think there was something there to it. You could still potentially combo on turn 3 using Ugin's Labyrinth and sorry, the Eldrazi Cyclers that can ramp into it as well. And especially now we've got more tools for it. You can just combo off using Geological Appraiser, Glasspool Mimic, Cursed Mirror, and Phantasmal Image, which means the package itself is smaller than it used to be, and you have way more room for interaction that's more expensive that you can cast early in the game, like Kaleem and stuff like that as well. So for me, I'm actually going to put this straight into Keep Nerfed, both because I do think it would be a really powerful deck with those tools that we've got now. You know, I think the big difference between the old build was that the whole deck had to be built around it for it to work. You had to be running the Appraiser, the 5-mana Naya 1, and Trumpeting Carnosaur. So your whole deck was basically just built around the combo. Now with Geological Appraiser and Cursed Mirror and Glasspool Mimic and Phantasmal Image, you can actually run a decent amount of interaction in the list as well. And beyond that as well, I do just think for gameplay reasons, it's not great to have in the format either, which is something I'm going to be taking into account, right? There are a number of cards on this list that might be safe on bans or, you know, could be borderline potentially, but if they did see play, they would probably lead to poor gameplay. So for that reason, I'm going to put it in Keep Nerf over Risky to Revert. I think it is just too risky to revert to put it in that category, if that makes sense. Then next up, Cauldron Familiar. I mean, this is probably the biggest slam dunk in why is this still nerfed. I keep hearing that the reason that this got hit was because it was taking ages, because the game's, you know, you've got to click through, you've got to sacrifice the cat, and then, you know, it'll go on the stack, then you've got to sacrifice the food, and there's like loads of clicks to get through, but Cat Oven is still legal in Explorer, and it's not really an issue there. I think the big reason why this got nerfed initially was because the deck it was seeing play in Historic, the Golgari food deck, the mirror matches for that deck were a slog. Some people loved it. Like, I didn't mind playing them, but very, very often it came down to who timed out. Very, very often it was who decked out first, who was playing quickest, because it is such a grind fest. You don't really close the game out as quickly. Is very, very attrition based. So I think because those Golgari food mirrors took so long, Cauldron Familiar took the hit. But you know, compared to some other combos that we've had to try and pull off, like the Ominous Traveler ones, using Cauldron Familiar really isn't a big deal, especially if you've played Arena for a long time and you know all the shortcuts, you know when to press space and stuff. You know, for gameplay reasons, for time reasons, it doesn't really make sense to me because, you know, it's the same sort of thing as it is an Explorer, really. And then in terms of power level, like, the ability for Cauldron Familiar to block, like, that's non-existent right now. Like, back when Golgari food was around, that did actually make quite a big difference. But in, you know, the current state of Historic, Cauldron Familiar just feels kind of a joke that it can't block right now. So for me, this is in why is this still nerfed for sure. Then Nardew's kind of an interesting one as well, because I believe this was originally nerfed for Brawl and not Historic. So it is still affected in Historic, but considering I've recently been testing with Nardew in its nerfed form and it's felt like close, I'm tempted to put it in one of these two for sure. I think for now I'm going to put it in Risky to Revert. Actually, no, I think I just have to put it in Keep Nerfed because we recently got Lightning Greaves. I think before we got an artifact that could equip for 0 that was cheap enough to see play, then I think we probably put it in Risky to Revert. But because we've got Lightning Greaves now, and because I have played with this in a landfall deck alongside the Cub that can put +1/+1 counters on stuff and target different creatures, and that actually felt, you know, reasonable. I don't think it was good or like a top tier deck, but I could tell, especially when we have Lightning Greaves, that this is going to be a big issue in Historic. So again, it's risky to unban, and I also think it would lead to pretty poor gameplay if this was a top tier deck. We've seen from Modern how oppressive Nardi was there, and we don't have all the tools that the Modern deck has, but it's pretty close. Especially, I think, for me, the big deal breaker that's keeping it in this bottom category here is having Lightning Greaves and just having a 0 equip, which is the main thing that really enables unnerfed Nardi to kind of pop off and go crazy. Then Minsk and Boo, again, I was debating whether to even put this on the list because it was never banned for power. Sorry, it was never nerfed for power level reasons. It was kind of preemptively nerfed because they thought that 4-mana Minsk and Boo would be too oppressive. And I tend to agree. This card has seen some play in the 5-mana form. Not very much recently, though. Like, this card doesn't really see much play at all in Historic, but this feels to me like one where it's a little too weak. Well, it's probably just generally too weak at 5 mana, but I think it would be too pushed at 4 mana. Like, the difference there between 4 and 5 mana is a really big deal. So for me, I'm going to put it into Risky to Revert rather than keep Nerfed, because we haven't actually seen it at 4 mana in Historic. And obviously, you know, we do have more powerful options in mid-range, which is where I think this would see play. You know, Pyrogoyf, obviously a 4 mana card that is seeing a lot of play right now and is, I was going to say is comparable on power level, but I actually think Minsc and Boo is quite a bit better than Pyrogoyf. So having thought about it in the moment, I do think that this is potentially in keep Nerfed. I mean, again, you could maybe make an argument that would be interesting to see it at 4 mana in Historic, but considering I do think it's quite a bit better than Pyrogoyf, and Pyrogoyf is seeing, you know, a lot of play in mid-range right now, I think it is probably too risky. Like, there's probably, you know, my head's telling me to put it here, but since we haven't seen it at 4 mana, I'm going to put it in this category for now. We might change it a little bit later. Then next up, we got the One Ring. So this was nerfed back when the One Ring plus Shieldred was kind of the top end of choice in both Rakdos and Jund mid-range, and at the time, these were definitely the best decks in the format. And the nerf to this is actually pretty big. So if you're not familiar, the original, you just cast, you get protection, and you can activate it without having to pay any other cost, whereas the nerfed version, you have to pay 1 to activate it. And this is actually a pretty substantial nerf, because if you cast this for 4 mana and you tap out, with the original, you cast it, you get protection, and you can activate it immediately, and then the following turn, you activate it again and you draw 2 cards, so you've drawn 3 cards total. If you compare that to the nerfed version, if you tap out for that, you can't activate it the same turn because you don't have the 1 mana. You don't have to wait a turn to activate it, so you've only got 1 card compared to 3. And then also for the rest of the game, you're going to be a turn ahead with the original one, so you're going to be drawing 3 cards when the nerfed one's going to be drawing 2. You're going to be drawing 4 cards while the nerfed one's drawing 3. So I definitely think it's a big nerf, but the fact it's still seeing play today in Historic, mainly in Valakut decks, you do occasionally see it in mid-range decks as well, but ever since the printing of Pyrogoyf and Barrogoyf, nerfed One Ring hasn't really seen play in mid-range shells in general, but the fact it is still seeing play in the Valakut decks, and also I do think the nerf on this card is pretty substantial compared to a lot of other cards on this list. I'm definitely happy to keep it nerfed. It's just whether we put it in Risky to Revert or keep nerfed. And looking at the cards in the categories at the moment, I think I'm more inclined to put it here alongside Minsc and Boo and Galvanic Discharge compared to the energy cards. But I could definitely see it moving down, you know, as I get later in the video and start ranking stuff within the tiers or start shuffling stuff about once I get a better idea of where stuff is, then I could see an argument for moving this down. I could also see an argument for moving Minsc and Boo down potentially, because I do think, you know, looking at these 2 cards, Minsc and Boo is probably the more powerful card. I mean, obviously, the big advantage of the One Ring is it's colorless, so it can be run in basically any deck. But for now, I'll leave them in Risky to Revert, and then we'll see. We'll readjust as we get later in the video. Then next up, we got Teferi Time Raveler, and I think this is one of the very first cards that did get rebalanced specifically for Historic. So if you're not familiar with the original, it's 3 mana as opposed to 4, which is obviously a massive difference. Anytime a nerf adds a mana, that's a very big deal. And then they also changed the passive from the opponent only being able to cast sorcery stuff at sorcery speed while Teferi's in play to the opponent can't cast stuff during your turn. And that also makes a pretty big difference, because with the unnerfed version, say you're during the opponent's turn, if they cast something and you counter it, the opponent doesn't get an opportunity to fight on the stack at all because they can't cast stuff outside of sorcery speed. So I think in terms of power level, the original is probably okay for Historic right now. I think it would be a powerful card, but I don't think it would be too oppressive. But I just don't like having it in the original form for gameplay reasons. I think instant speed stuff, fighting on the stack is such an integral part of, you know, Magic in general, but still an important factor in Historic, and having a card that is very easy to cast on turn 2 because of the amount of acceleration we've got that just shuts off instant speed stuff for the rest of the game is really oppressive. Not to mention, I think power level as a generic card, it's probably alright, but most of the time this does see play is likely going to be in combo decks that are worried about counter spells, so it's also often used as protection for combo decks, which I don't really like either. So for gameplay reasons, you know, just in terms of this can create a kind of miserable experience, it can just immediately shut off counterspell decks, which I don't think is the right thing to do at Historic right now when counterspell decks and instant speed decks are already struggling. So for me, power level wise, it's probably okay to revert, but because of gameplay reasons, I'm going to put it in Risky to Revert rather than probably safe. The next up we got Sorin. So this was actually, rebalanced fairly recently. It was last year. And they changed it so that the minus ability to cheat a vampire into play only works if the vampire costs 6 or less. So the big reason this got nerfed was because the Sorin decks with Sorin plus Saint Elenda were just really oppressive. Basically, every mid-range shell revolved around that. There were 5 or 6 different Sorin variants, and they were all so dominant in the format. So rather than risky to revert, I'm going to put this one straight into keep nerf just because it was so recent and it did have a big impact. Now, you could argue that, Sorin wasn't even the best deck in the format once Eldrazi Temple got printed, right? There were a lot of people saying, oh, okay, now they've allowed Eldrazi Temple. Eldrazi is actually pushing Sorin out of the format when it was the most dominant deck. But I like keeping Sorin nerfed because otherwise every single mid-range shell just becomes a Sorin deck. And I think it's nice to have not just the ubiquitous best thing to be doing in a mid-range deck. I think it's good to have some mid-range shells running the Goyf, some mid-range shells running, alternative builds with, Overlord and Failure and stuff like that. So I like not having Sorin in the format because it just feels like every single mid-range deck will be Sorin plus Saint Elenda. Not to mention, I think, I still hope Eldrazi Temple is going to get hit on the next BNR. And if that does happen and Sorin was suddenly reverted, I do just think it immediately becomes one of the best decks. Like I've said for a little while recently, I do think if Eldrazi Temple does get banned, that Jund midrange is one of the front runners to become one of the best decks in the format, because Jund is in a pretty interesting spot right now where it really struggles against Eldrazi, which is an issue right now when it's one of the most popular decks, but it has a really good matchup against a lot of the other decks that are trying to beat Eldrazi, the fast aggro and combo decks. And so I feel like, if you had Sorin plus the Goyfs, or, maybe the Goyfs wouldn't even see play if Sorin was legal again. So again, I'm happy to put this in the keep nerf just because it was so recent and we know how powerful this card becomes, especially if Eldrazi does get hit. Then Orcish Bowmasters. This is probably the most interesting one for me on here because, well, before I get into it, if you're not familiar, the nerf on this is that it originally came down, pinged a creature and made a token, which made it naturally good against 1 toughness creatures. Now it doesn't do that when it enters, it only does it when the opponent draws. So it's basically seen no play in nerfed form because it's so weak without that immediate impact on the board. And honestly, I would be pretty happy to unnerf Bowmasters, but this is more of a personal preference thing. I remember playing prior to it being nerfed, and I do actually really like the effect it had on the format. The games felt really skillful and interactive, and I feel like the stuff it tends to push out of the format, like the 1 toughness creatures, a lot of those are quite polarizing cards to play against, like Esper Sentinel, Thalia, 1-mana Mana Dorks, and stuff like that. So I actually quite enjoyed playing with Bowmasters in the format. I don't think it was too oppressive. I don't think the other sort of decks it punishes, like Lotus Field or Phoenix, or, just decks that draw a bunch as part of their gameplay, they are generally degenerate decks, so I don't mind them getting punished by Bowmasters. So I think for me, Bowmasters is going to be the first card to go in, probably safe to revert, but this might just be because I don't really like the state that Historic is in right now, and I did really enjoy playing the format with Bowmasters. One of the reasons that this did get nerfed in the first place was it did see play in basically every single black deck, but again, I don't think that's much of an issue, really. I think Bowmasters, you're not gonna ban Thoughtseize or nerf Thoughtseize because it's played in every black deck. I think it's like a pretty good card to have in the format. Now, again, the issue going forwards is it does limit 1 toughness creatures' viability, and if there are some cool 1 toughness creatures that, basically immediately don't even get a look in, then that is potentially damaging to the format. But we already have Goblin Bombardment that does kind of a similar thing, and we'll talk about that when we get to Crucius a little bit later. But for me personally, this is more of a personal preference thing. I mean, I could see an argument for putting it here, but I would quite like to have Bowmasters back in the format, get a bit more interactivity, get more of those intricate interactive games, push out those more degenerate combo decks that just need to draw as part of it. And also, I do feel, like I said, that a lot of the 1 toughness creatures are kind of polarizing and can be miserable to play against. So for me, I'd be happy to unnerf Bowmasters personally. The next up we got Omnath, and for me, this just goes straight into why is this still nerfed. So if you're not familiar with this card, it's basically 5 mana in nerfed form, 4 mana in original form. Now, at the time, the ramp decks that this was played in were pretty good. They were basically just a port over of the standard ramp builds, using stuff like Lotus Cobra and Fabled Passage to produce a bunch of mana really quickly and then cast like an ultimatum to win the game, for example. But even at the time, I didn't really get the impression that this was oppressively good compared to other stuff. And considering how quickly Historic got power crept, just with new sets at the time, even at the time, like a couple months after it got nerfed, I don't really think it would see much play. And, without a high density of fetch lands, it's difficult to consistently get all 4 colors of mana to cast this, even today, even in 2026 Historic. With Prismatic Vista as the only really good playable fetch land, you aren't going to consistently be able to get the extra mana off this. So right now, this is kind of baffling. Like, this could easily be reverted back and it would probably see no play whatsoever. And I honestly think that would still be the case, 2 or 3 years ago as well. So yeah, this one's straight into why is this still nerfed. And I'll definitely be rearranging these as we get towards the end of the video. The next up, we got Winota. So this is, or the difference in the nerf, the original would trigger to look at the top and put a human into play off each non-human that attacked, whereas now you only get 1 trigger per turn, which is obviously a very big difference. Now, nerfed Winota has seen some play, but it only really saw play in a very short period of time. And I'm not even sure how widespread it was, because I was one of the people pushing it, so it's hard for me to tell whether, I felt like it was being played a lot because I was playing it a lot myself, or whether other people actually picked it up. So the time period where it did see play in nerfed form was around the same time that the One Ring and Shieldred was everywhere. And then you would run Winota and Will as like the top end human to cheat into play. And then if you cheated Will into play, you could steal the opponent's One Ring or Shieldred, which applied a lot of pressure to them, right? If you steal Shieldred once they've got the One Ring in play, then activating it deals them a bunch of damage. If they only had one of them in play, you could just steal whichever one they had. So it has seen some play in nerfed form, but like I said, that was only a very specific metagame, and it's basically seen no play in nerfed form since then. Now, this does actually change how the deck is built quite a lot. So whilst it is easy to say, oh, it hasn't seen any play in nerfed form outside of one very specific format, so it's probably safe to unnerf, you do have to think that the decks have to be built pretty differently, where nerfed version of Winota really incentivizes you to run expensive big humans to cheat into play, like Agent of Treachery, Angrath's Marauders, Will, and stuff like that, which are clunky to draw. Whereas the original Winota, you could afford to just run cheaper, more hard-castable humans, and because you would get multiple triggers off your smaller non-humans attacking, it didn't really matter that you didn't have like a massive Agent of Treachery, Angrath's Marauders style big human to cheat into play, which made the deck a lot more consistent. So not only would the original be more powerful, but it would also make the deck as a whole more consistent, because you don't have to run those big, impactful, high-end humans for the deck to be playable. And also you have to remember that Winota as an archetype is just going to keep getting more and more tools. They're going to keep printing good, cheap non-humans. They're going to keep printing humans that have an impact when they enter the battlefield as well. So I do think that you have to be careful with cards like Winota that will improve over time as more cards get added to the format. But honestly, I do think Winota would probably be safe to revert. We do have, for this to work, you have to resolve a 4-mana creature and then have it survive to combat, which has, it can be hit by counter spells, it can be hit by discard spells, it can be hit by instant speed removal as well. Not to mention you do have to build your deck somewhat around it, right? You do have to make sure you've got a split of humans and non-humans to trigger it. And additionally, if you do want to make, good use of the non-nerfed version, you have to run a high density of cheap creatures, likely acceleration, like Mana Dorks, which don't necessarily work that well with some of the other humans and non-humans that you're working with as well. So I do have a caveat. I think out of all the cards, this is probably the most borderline one between probably safe and risky to revert. But for now, I'm going to put it in probably safe to revert, because whilst it is powerful, it is a 4-mana sorcery speed creature. It is very easy to disrupt. But having said that, like I said, it does just work generically well with good humans and non-humans, as long as you consider the curve out with Winota. But yeah, I'm going to put it in probably safe to revert now, but I'll maybe have a look at it as we get towards the end of the video and I reshuffle stuff. The next up, Fragment Reality. So this was changed so that it can't target your own stuff, because if you played around the time when this was in its original form, there was a mainly best of one deck where you'd basically just run a bunch of the 4-mana ley lines that you can obviously put into play if they're in your opening hand, and then you would just hard mulligan to that, plus a land, plus Fragment Reality, and then on turn 1, you'd fragment your own ley line to get a Geist of Saint Traft into play, which is really difficult to interact with. And to be honest, that deck was just miserable to play against. Some people did try run it in best of 3 as well. It just basically changed so everyone had to run Edict style effects, and it's just not great for gameplay reasons in general. Now, my one caveat about this card is that I am frustrated that it did also shut down some other cool stuff that you could do with Fragment Reality. So, for example, I had a few decks where you would play Leyline Binding, and then you could Fragment Reality your own Leyline Binding to cheat a big creature into play, like a Jeru and Hazaret, to then cheat another big creature into play. And you could do stuff like Fragment Reality your own One Ring to cheat a Flage or a Snapcaster Mage into play as well to stop you taking damage off the burden counters. But I don't think being able to do any of that stuff is worth bringing back that Leyline deck. It was similar to Tyvalt's Trickery. It's just kind of a miserable linear deck. The opponent mulligans, gets it off turn 1, and then if you don't have an Edict effect, you're probably just going to be losing the game. So for gameplay reasons more than anything else, I'm going to put this in Keep Nerf, just because that deck was just not great for the format. The next up, we got Racketeer Boss. So this was changed so that the Perpetual Treasure effect disappears the first time you use it. So if you're not familiar with why this card got nerfed in the first place, this was a core, or one of the main ways that you could enable the Ominous Traveler combo deck. So there were multiple ways that you could use it, but basically the idea with that deck was you would discount Ominous Traveler either to 0 with Goblin Trap Finder, that I'll get to in a second, or with Racketeer Boss and another discount effect. And then basically you would just cast the Ominous Traveler, get a card into your hand, cast that, then the Ominous Traveler would bounce, then you'd sacrifice that to Ashnod's Altar, and you'd basically just keep spamming stuff onto the board until you've got Dominating Vampires, and then you would be able to steal your opponent's stuff, give your creatures haste, and then win the game. So I'm happy to keep that deck gone from the format for a number of reasons, but mainly of all is just gameplay, right? If they're going to nerf Cauldron Familiar because they think people sacrificing the cat and then bringing the cat back with the food token is like long for gameplay reasons, Ominous Traveler is just the worst card for that. If you've played with or against that deck, you know it's literally just sitting there, and if you're playing the deck, playing it basically like an RTS where you have to play so quickly to not hit the 5-minute term limit. You have to pick your cards really quickly. Your Ominous Traveler, get it back, think, okay, what card do I need to go for next? You want to go for the cheaper creatures and then Dominating Vampire. It was just awful to play with because you're basically just playing against the arena clock, and then it's awful to play against because it's not deterministic. The opponent might hit the time limit, so you've just got to let them play it out. So for that reason, I'm just happy to keep the Racketeer Boss nerfed. I mean, again, out of this and Trap Finder that I'll get to in a second, there's maybe an argument to putting it to here, but this is only ever going to see play in Historic for degenerate purposes if it does go back to its original form. And whilst on terms of a power level, it'd be interesting to see how the Ominous Traveler decks would do in current Historic. I still think they would be very, very good. But in terms of just gameplay, horrible to play with, horrible to play against. So very happy to keep this one nerfed. And then Trap Finder was basically the other way that you would get your Ominous Traveler discounted so that you could combo off. And this one, again, straight into keep nerfed, not only because I want to keep the Ominous Traveler combo out of the format for gameplay reasons, but also because it still sees play now, right? Racketeer Boss doesn't, but again, Racketeer Boss for me in Historic is a card that is either seeing no play, or if it does see play, it's seeing play in a really degenerate deck that isn't particularly fun to play with or against. Trap Finder not only does that, but it also sees play in sacrifice decks like Mardu, sacrifice decks like Samwise. I'm sure it's going to see play in Goblin decks as people experiment with Birthing Ritual Goblins after the new ones we got from Lorwyn Eclipse. So again, the fact a nerfed card is still seeing play in Historic is a really good sign to me that the nerf is good. And it's, because for a rebalance to be good, I think you want the cards to not be as oppressive, but still be playable. And Trap Finder, the nerf for me, has, hit that balance perfectly. So yeah, very happy to keep this one nerfed. Then Painful Bond. So this was a pretty drastic change. I believe they changed it so that previously it would make any more expensive cards in your hand deal you damage, whereas now it causes cheaper cards to do you damage. And that difference is absolutely night and day. So when this came out, it was just a slam dunk 4 of in all of the Lurrus decks, basically, right? Lurrus decks were already some of the best decks in the format because everything in the deck is super efficient. You always have access to Lurrus as kind of a stopgap as well. And then Painful Bond was literally just 2 mana, draw 2, maybe make your Lurrus deal you 1 damage if it's already in your hand. This card was just stupid in its original form, if I'm being honest. Would basically see play as a 4 of in every single Lurrus deck because almost every single Lurrus deck is running black in the first place. So for me, absolutely keep this nerf. Now again, it is annoying that it is a card that basically sees no play now in nerfed form, but the original form was just so much better than it that I think there's no real argument to reverting this one. Then next up we got Inquisitor Captain. So this is kind of similar to Geological Appraiser in a way, in that the original form didn't have the clause if you cast it. So basically the idea with this card in the original deck was that you would run this alongside a bunch of clone effects, and then you'd cast the Inquisitor Captain, see 2 creatures, pick a clone, copy the Inquisitor Captain, go again, go again, go again, go again. And now that we've got stuff like Cursed Mirror, it would work very similarly to Geological Appraiser. But the big thing with Inquisitor Captain is you don't need to build your whole deck around it. You can run other cheaper creatures because you get a choice of 2, right? And so likelihood is, even if you hit one of your non-clone effects, the other card that you hit is likely to be a clone, so you can go off. And then, like I said, with Cursed Mirror that starts giving your board haste, this goes from, back when it was oppressive and it did get originally nerfed, you would basically just go from an empty board, Inquisitor Captain, clone, and swarm the board and just attack the following turn, so you're still vulnerable to sweepers and stuff. Now with Cursed Mirror, actually having said that, Inquisitor Captain can't hit Cursed Mirror, can it? Because it's not a creature. But either way, I still think it would be not beneficial to the format to revert this. It has seen some play in the past as kind of an addition to Collected Company to try and find specific 3-drop creatures, like in the Scariote combo in the past. So for me, it is annoying because I do feel like it would see a lot of play in unnerfed form, and it basically sees no play in nerfed form right now. But again, for gameplay reasons, similar to Geological Appraiser, you don't really want these sorts of cards that, can just win you the game from a completely empty board if you just happen to top deck it and build your deck around it. So again, maybe because it can't hit Cursed Mirror and can't give your whole board haste, it's alright. But having said that, you could just run Tuck Rubble Fort, run a bunch of clones and Tuck Rubble Fort, and then just hit that to give your whole board haste instead. So for me, I think, you can maybe put an argument for here that it would be okay in the current format, but I don't really like these sorts of cards like Inquisitor Captain and Geological Appraiser that even if you're, completely behind on board, completely out of cards in your hand, you just top deck this and you win the game out of nowhere. I don't think that's particularly good for gameplay. And then finally, we got my boy Crucius. I accidentally added an extra one, so we got double Crucius here, but this one's difficult for me because I've got a soft spot for Crucius because it is one of the cards that I brewed with the most when it came out. I think using Crucius to tutor stuff is really interesting, and it does have a pretty significant drawback that if the opponent has a piece of removal before you get to your end step, it does literally do nothing, which is definitely a drawback for a 3-mana card. Now, the nerf, if you're not familiar, it was originally a 3/3 and then got rebalanced to a 3/1, which at the time was just immediately made the card unplayable because Orcish Bowmasters was legal in its original form and was seeing play in basically every single deck. So you really couldn't afford to run Crucius back then, where you cast it, it dies to Bowmasters, and you're super far behind in that exchange. But obviously, Bowmasters has since been nerfed itself. So the only real card that punishes you for running this as a 3/1 is Goblin Bombardment, which is a big deal, right? And also, another thing about it is it has seen play very recently in the Jund Goyf's deck as a way to tutor for Pyrogoyf more consistently, and is obviously just a generically good mid-range card as well. But for me, when I'm building Jund, I just do not think Crucius is the right card to run because I think you've already got good alternatives to run in the 3-mana slot. Fable of the Mirror Breaker works very well with the Goyfs, as does the new Indomitable Speaker, John Emmanuel Dupra's World Championship card that just came out in Lorwyn Eclipsed. And so, even though Crucius has seen play very recently, I don't see it seeing play long term. I think Speaker does a thing much more consistently than it. But and also, I don't think the 1 toughness really makes a difference outside of the energy matchup, where Bombardment and Galvanic Discharge really make a difference when it's 1 toughness as opposed to 3. So there are arguments between probably safe to revert and risky to revert, but I'm going to put it in probably safe to revert right now. This could be biased because I do really like the card, and I do think it can lead to some really interesting deck building, especially if you do use it to tutor stuff consistently, but I feel like right now in Historic, it would probably be okay. Like I said, there aren't too many decks where the difference makes, where it does make too much difference, and 3 mana cards in general have to be really good, and having to run a 3 mana card that doesn't provide you any value until the end step when instant speed removal is still fairly common makes me think that it's probably okay. But again, if you played when this card was very popular, you know how snowbally it can become. And again, I think the big reason why it did get nerfed originally was because the quality of interaction is so low that very few decks could consistently kill Crucius before it activated for that first trigger. And again, I mean, I don't really think we've had too many great quality instant speed pieces of interaction added to the format, but I do think the format sped up to a point now where running Crucius, even in unnerfed form, has its drawbacks. So I'm going to put it into probably safe to revert right now, but you could make the argument to put it in risky as well. So that's how I rank things at first glance. I'm just going to quickly reorder stuff though. I might potentially move stuff from within the tiers, and then I'm also going to try and rank stuff within the tiers as well. So top left is basically as safe to revert as possible, and then bottom right all the way down here is going to be the riskiest to revert. So within why is this still nerfed? I mean, these two have to be top left. There's, they basically saw no play whatsoever in Historic, even prior to the nerf. So these have to go here. Then I think we have to put Cauldron Familiar next to them again. The ability for this to block is not going to make any real difference. Like, obviously, it's going to be a buff to the Samwise decks, but those decks already aren't very good, so giving it a little buff, enabling you to block against aggressive decks, is going to be a slight upside there. Then I think we put Omnath there, and then DRC, and then, I think Unholy Heat is probably the one that would likely see the most play, but again, I don't think it would be a problem. And in fact, I'm gonna swap these round, because I think there is a chance that DRC would see more play in kind of Underworld Breach decks, but having said that, the 3 toughness doesn't really make any difference in those sorts of decks anyway. So I think I'm happy with the ordering here. Then probably safe to revert. I definitely think Bowmasters is probably the safest out of these 3. And then out of these 2, this is tricky because I do think... I think I'm going to put Crucius slightly safer than Winota because I do think Winota has a much higher ceiling in terms of what it can do. But I'm pretty happy with the, the ordering on this one. Then risky to revert... I mean, I think for me, Galvanic Discharge is definitely the highest here. Like I said, I think the biggest issue, or one of the biggest issues with Historic in terms of a lack of good interactive gameplay recently has been that the interaction we have doesn't really line up with the threats that we've got. And whilst Galvanic Discharge would obviously be a buff to energy, I was running this in other decks that weren't running energy because it is essentially Lightning Bolt that can't go face, that can also scale if you use it to kill smaller creatures and you're running it in multiples. So I actually think that this would be a net positive for the format as a whole and lead to more interactive gameplay. Then out of these 3, I mean, it's tricky because in terms of power level, I think Teferi probably needs to go here, but in terms of gameplay, I really don't like it because, instant speed stuff is such a core part of the game, and I think if this does see play, it's likely to defend degenerate combo decks as well. So I think I'm going to put that there. And then out of these 2, I actually think I'm more worried about Minsc and Boo. And to be honest, thinking about it, I'm kind of tempted to put Minsc and Boo down here, if I'm being honest, because I have played against it when it was 5 mana. Well, sorry, I have played against it at 5 mana in Historic, and it did still look pretty good back then. And I've obviously played against it at 4 mana in Timeless, and it's felt good at 4 mana in Timeless. Now, obviously, this was quite a while ago. Timeless has improved a lot and, has got power crept to the point where Minsc and Boo doesn't really see much play at all anymore, but I still think at 4 mana, this would be a slam dunk in Jund. We see Pyrogoyf see play, and I think this is just better. So I'm actually going to put Minsc and Boo down. But yeah, I'm pretty happy with the ordering here. Then on this row, I mean, I think I'm going to put the stuff to the far right first. So Nardu, I think, having seen what it did to Modern, especially now we actually have a an artifact that can equip for 0 mana, this would probably be the most problematic to unnerf. Then we'll have a look at these. I mean, I'm going to put Trap Finder here as well, because not only does it enable the Traveler combo deck, which I think probably would be able to compete in the current format, and is also miserable for gameplay reasons, and it also is already seeing play in sacrifice decks. I'm going to put this one pretty far down as well. I think Ocelot Pride also has to go really far down on here, because, you know, Guide of Souls, I mean, it's definitely a big boost if you put it back to its original form, but the difference between 2 and 1 mana on Ocelot Pride is absolutely huge compared to the Guide of Souls, so I'm going to put that there. Then I think I'll put Appraiser ahead of Inquisitor Captain, because I think that it's easier to consistently combo with it than it is compared to Inquisitor Captain. Although you could probably run them together, right? I hadn't even thought about that it could provide you redundancy in the same sort of deck. That's a pretty scary thought to begin with, but yeah, I think Appraiser is probably more of a worry. Then Minsk and Boo, I actually think I'm going to put here, because I think Appraiser, whilst it is annoying that you have to constantly hold up interaction if you are playing against the deck, at least you have that point of interaction, whereas Minsk and Boo is just going to snowball the game very quickly, especially now that Jund tends to run Ignoble Hierarch and Malevolent Rumble. You can cast this on turn 3 pretty consistently, which is... the thought of that is pretty scary. Thinking about it, I can't believe I had it in Risky to Revert for so long. Painful Bond, I think I'm going to put it here, because Black Lurus decks are going to be a part of the format in one form or another, and Painful Bond would basically see play in all of them, apart from maybe Auras. It doesn't really synergize very well with Auras, but 2 mana draw 2 with basically no downside in a Lurus deck is pretty pushed, in my opinion. Fragment Reality, I mean, I don't want to play against that Leyline deck, but compared to some of the other cards we've got here, I would rather play against the Leyline deck than the Traveler deck or the Geological Appraiser deck. It also does have a mulligan rate of itself, and like I said, there are some other positives to reverting it as well, like being able to hit your own Leyline Binding or One Ring to enable some cool stuff. Sorin, I think I'm going to put Sorin here, because like I said, you know, we've seen how broken Sorin plus Elenda is just generally, and just how ubiquitous it is in terms of all the mid-range decks would just be running Sorin. Yeah, I mean, just because it's so recent and was still so impactful last year, I'm going to put this a little bit further down. And then Guide of Souls, I mean, again, I don't think we should unnerf this at all. That's why it's in Keep Nerf. But compared to all the other cards, I think, you know, just needing 1 energy fewer isn't as bad as playing against the Leyline deck, playing against the Traveler deck, having a 1-card win on an empty board, if that makes sense. So that's the tier list. Honestly, I'm pretty happy with this overall. And looking back on it, there aren't really that many cards here that are completely safe to revert, and most of them are kind of ones that most of the community would agree are kind of here just because they haven't been addressed yet, right? All of these cards will be completely safe. And then as soon as you move on to probably safe to revert, there's already a lot of debate to be had about all the cards from here downwards, if that makes sense. So I'm kind of surprised, because I thought there were a lot more cards that would be safe to unnerf, especially as they were done quite a long time ago. But for me, I think only these 6 are completely safe, really. Bowmasters is more of a personal preference for me, but I do think in general they've done a decent job at addressing the historic specific stuff, you know, since the Bowmasters nerf and stuff like that. The early nerfs for me are a little bit egregious, but again, they were years ago in a completely different format. So I'd be very interested to see how Wizards wants to address this going forwards, because they did say in a fairly recent article that they plan on having a look at the entire historic ban philosophy. So it'd be interesting to see if they unban stuff, if they unnerf stuff, what they're going to do for there. Definitely let me know in the comments what you think, if there's any of these that you disagree with, because I'm sure there are. Also, let me know in the comments if there are any cards that I missed off here, because it was actually surprisingly difficult to find a comprehensive list of all the cards that were nerfed specifically in Historic, right? Cards like Crucius don't show up as nerfed on Untapped because the stats have changed. Same with Trap Finders, same with Fragment Reality and stuff like that. So there is a chance that I have missed some cards off that were nerfed specifically for Historic. So let me know in the comments if there are any. And I'll reply in the comments with my thoughts if there are. But overall, this was kind of interesting to look at. I do hope that Wizards does have a look at some of these rebalanced cards when they do have a look at the format, especially these 6 up here. But for the most part, I do think that, you know, the stuff that they have rebalanced, especially in recent years, is good to stay rebalanced and wouldn't really be a net positive for the format. But either way, like I said, let me know in the comments what you think. Either way, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll catch you on the next one. Big up.